Hello and welcome to Partially Redacted, a podcast where we discuss privacy and security engineering and related topics. I'm your host, Sean Faulkner, and today I'm joined by Joice John, Senior Product Manager at Skyflow, and we'll be talking about managing unstructured data and the various privacy and security challenges you might encounter when working with unstructured data. Joice, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me. Long-time admirer of the pod and, of all the work you do inside and outside of Skyflow.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you very much. I like when guests come with compliments for me. So thank you. But thanks for being here. I feel like this is overdue. We chat. We are fortunate that we both live somewhat locally to the Bay Area. So we see each other actually in person from time to time. So I'm glad that we were finally found a great topic to have. And also, essentially we're able to align our schedules and have you here today.
Awesome. Yep. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. So why don't we start off with an introduction? Who are you and what do you do?
Sure. So my name is Joice. So I work at Skyflow. At Skyflow, I'm the lead product manager for what we term as secure workflows. It's essentially comprised of three products where we give you the ability to ingest sensitive data into our platform, share sensitive data securely with trusted third parties, and also we give you the ability to run custom workflows on your secure data without ever compromising your security and your compliance posture. Prior to that, I spent time at Microsoft, working on Azure Kubernetes hybrid service, working on the resiliency of that. Spent some time working on RBAC and just-in-time access for the Azure Stack platform. I was before that I spent close to 7-8 years at Nutanix. I was lucky enough to be part of some really wonderful teams at Nutanix working on data protection and data path and disaster recovery. And I was one of the PMs where we launched for the cloud service at Nutanix, where we launched a disaster recovery product where we were able to scale from about 15 odd customers to 350 odd customers. Worked with some really talented folks there and had a blast over there. But yeah, that's pretty much about me. Started my career as a systems sort of a programmer guy, and then sort of moved into product management after about 6 years.
Yeah, what was that transition like? What sort of interested you in moving from engineering into product?
Yeah, so it was it was because of a couple of sort of really interesting product managers we had at Nutanix, and who I sort of worked closely with. And over the course of sort of working closely with them as sort of the engineering lead on some of the projects, I wanted to do something different as well. And I thought here is a role which sort of talks directly to the customer. You're involved you're involved in sort of identifying the requirements and sort of solving actual customer pain points. And that sort of interested me. And I sort of had this interesting experience with a large sort of a customer where I doubled up both as a product manager and as sort of the engineering lead for that, and then I eventually sort of made the switch to the PM side. So that was my sort of overall transition from engineering to PM.
Yeah. Do you miss day-to-day coding, getting in there, getting to twiddle the bits?
I do actually. Yeah, I miss the sort of the day-to-day sort of the engineering aspects of it, because you are much more involved in it, and you're sort of in the weeds and sort of doing things. I do miss it occasionally, but there are some days where I don't miss it as well. So,
yeah, nice. Well, I'm sure having that background helps a lot in, especially with like such a technical product as Skyflow, and having to interface with engineers and have them, be able to, sort of talk the same language and meet them where they're at and explain like, why we're making certain product decisions and how the technology aligns with those things and so forth.
No, absolutely. That definitely helps that, we can speak the same language, and, I can sort of empathize with the engineering team and sort of, bring in sort of a customer perspective to that as well. And I've been fortunate to be working with teams who understand the other side of that as well. So I'm very happy to have that background.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's start to get into our topic at hand. So, before we get too deep, I want to just help set some context for anyone that's maybe new to this area. So what is unstructured data and how is that different than structured data?
Yeah. So, unstructured data, as the name suggests, it doesn't have a predefined data model. It's not organized in a predefined manner. It can come in various formats, such as, text documents, emails, social media posts, logs as well. And because it lacks a fixed schema, it makes it more challenging to sort of, analyze and compare to structured data, right? And in fact, close to 80 to 90% of all the data generated is actually unstructured data, right? So which means, there's a vast amount of, treasure trove of information stored in this data that, that companies want to sort of, extract, right? The main differences lie essentially in the fact that, in their organization and how they're stored, on the desk. It follows structured data, obviously follows a specific format, like, rows and columns, just like how you would in your databases. CSV is a sort of a semi-structured semi-structured data, but unstructured data lacks any of those predefined formats, right? They're just stored as blobs, like, your S3 or like, data lakes and all of those things.
Yeah, I feel like, as you mentioned, like 80 to 90% of all data is unstructured. Like even, we're recording right now on video and audio. That's a great example of, very unstructured data. That also is like, it's meaty data, especially video, because it's going to be, images at high definition and stuff. So it's a lot of ways like a more complex data type to work with. But there's all these companies that are kind of sitting on this like mountain of unstructured data that until very recently, the last decade or so, we just didn't really have technology to help us like easily unlock it. So what are some of the technologies that are involved with actually helping businesses work with unstructured data and manage it?
Yeah. Great question, right? So it really depends on the kind of unstructured data as well, right? Like, for example, image and video analysis require a different set of technologies like, facial detection, object detection, entity classification, all of those things. For text-based, it's like, NLP-based techniques are used mostly for things like sentiment analysis, a text summarization, and data leaks, right? Data leaks have sort of, sprung up in the decade or so, and, they are sort of the storage repositories for that can store vast amounts of these unstructured data. And they provide the centralized and sort of a scalable infrastructure for storing all of these diverse data types, right? A sampling of the technologies would be, we can go right from ingestion. So the moment you ingest data into say a data lake, right, there are tools which will help you sort of ingest all of those data. They could be both real time or batch. Things like Apache Kafka or Apache NiFi, are things that come to mind. So once you've ingested the data, you need to sort of like, catalog the metadata so that you can search it. You can sort of, organize it and catalog it and annotate it. This is where things like, Apache Atlas, and, the AWS the data glue, catalog come into picture. Then once you've sort of organized it once you've sort of organized the metadata, you need some sort of a data processing framework to essentially work on this data in a distributed manner. And like, again, you need support for both batch and real time operations on this data, so that you can do complex data transformation and analytics. And this is where things like, Apache Spark comes into picture. And obviously there's Databricks, which is sort of, the paid version of Apache Spark. And once you've sort of processed the data, you need some sort of a query language kind of interface to actually, interact with this data. A sort of a SQL-like interface, right? And this is where things like, Presto and Hive come into, Apache Hive come into the picture. Then on top of that, now you have your machine learning model. How do you deploy machine learning models, and how do you deploy these AI algorithms on top of this data? So this is where things like TensorFlow and PyTorch sort of come in, right? Then there's obviously the visualization aspect of the whole data, right? How do you visualize all of this data? And this is where you have Tableau, Power BI, Click, and all of these things, come in, right? And more importantly, I think, what we are more interested is in the security and governance, right? And although it's sort of the last one in my list, but like, it's sort of, it's super critical. So, we want to ensure that the privacy and security of this unstructured data is always safeguarded. And, we want to have things like encryption at rest, tokenization, encryption in transit, data masking, auditing, and all of these things. And this way, Skyflow can definitely help customers. We also have things like, Apache Ranger and all of those things as well. So this is sort of a sampling of sort of the various technologies that, that we sort of deal with when we are working with unstructured data.
Yeah, I feel like you probably named 15 to 20 different, Apache projects and various tools when we started talking about unstructured data. And I feel like the tool chain just to get started with working with unstructured data is like more complicated than if you were just starting sort of like the hello world equivalent with relational data or something like that. Like to kind of get started in that world is fairly simplistic at this point. It's also much more developed. It's been around. Like I think their first relational databases were in the late 70s. So we're talking about like 50 years plus of development versus the data lake, which has really been around for maybe like 15 years. And then from the data lake, there's the lake house, kind of the evolution there. But to even be able to get to a place where you could start to query the unstructured data in a lake, you have to do a fair amount of sort of like pre-work to set up the metadata. Can you talk a little bit about like what that process is just to get to a place where, hey, I can now start to actually query this information? Because essentially you have to do like some level of pre-processing. It's not like I just throw files into an S3 bucket and find, suddenly magic happens.
Right. Totally. Right. So I think spot on. So for SQL, I think, structured query languages existed for so long. Because the data is all structured, you can sort of programmatically manipulate it, and you can create entries, delete entries, query entries, much more easy, right? So for unstructured data, you need much more complex programmatic and programmatic manipulation and sort of ML techniques. Typically unstructured data requires a lot of pre-processing before it can be consumed, and the sort of the common framework that we see our customers deploy this is basically what is called as a medallion architecture, right? So what this means is that as the data goes through the lakehouse right from its inception, it sort of goes through progressively different stages where at each stage the data is enriched. Sort of a cooking analogy here would be, so at the first layer is basically called the bronze layer, where you sort of get your raw data from its sources, like your IoT sensors, your PubSub mechanism, or wherever, right? Like wherever all your data is coming from. And then this is basically, think of it as sort of your raw materials for your cooking, right? Like your veggies, your proteins, and all those things. And you sort of assemble it before you do any of the cooking, right? And then the next stage is basically the silver layer, where the data in this layer, it goes through a cleaning and validation process. Inconsistencies are fixed, so errors are cleaned up, errors are removed, and data is transformed into a much more consistent format. This is sort of your mise en place at the stage of cooking, right? You've chopped up your veggies, you chopped up your proteins, you have your aromatics, and at this point you're ready to go, right? And the last stage is essentially sort of the gold layer, right? So this is where sort of all the processing happens, right? So once you have your validated data, you could augment it, with adding it more relevant data sets, or adding it, combining it even with structured data sets, and then sort of running your business logic on top of it. And this is where sort of this sort of the actual cooking stage, right? Where you're sort of putting together you're deriving insights and all of those things. So this is sort of the framework that we've seen our customers sort of deploy on their environments, and I think this is also what is recommended by Databricks as well.
And then where does, in that kind of like pipeline that you're talking about, where we're going through these stages of enriching the data so that we can actually start to do something with it, where does security and privacy kind of like fit in there? And what tools would you be using, or what types of things are you trying to sort of safeguard the users of that information, and as well as the if there is essentially customer data in there, like how do we protect it?
Yeah. So as it goes through various stages, what we've seen is that in the bronze layer is typically where all the data is sort of aggregated, and then once you have it at that level, so as part of the cleaning process is where you would essentially ensure, say for example, you have sensitive data, you want to make sure that when it goes into the analytics to make that we are not inadvertently revealing some secure information. This is where you would do things like tokenization. This is where you would do things like masking. This is where you would put in access controls to the data, saying that only, say, customer support can only access this, say marketing cannot access this, or vice versa. So the silver stage is where usually you would apply a lot of these data transformations, and this is a stage where you can use Skyflow's sort of UDFs, which you provide out of the box, to actually help you with de-identifying a lot of those data sets and to make sure that when the data actually goes into the gold layer before you run analytics on it, it is completely de-identified, and you don't have any sensitive information lurking there.
And then, do you think that the actually from a privacy security perspective, is there something different or harder about doing this for unstructured data versus sort of more traditional relational data?
Yeah, so the difficulty in sort of aligning all the security principles with unstructured data is primarily because of the fact that there are diverse sort of formats, right? There are diverse sources of this information coming in from, and obviously there's no predefined organization, right? So just the kind of sources the data is coming from, the data variety, right? It could be text documents, sensor data, audio, video. We named a bunch of these things, right? So all of these things will have a unique will present unique challenges for privacy protection. You might need to decrypt it differently. You might need to anonymize it differently. There will be different data structures in each of these data sources, right? And also in some of this unstructured data, there's a lot more granular information and contextual information that sometimes is present, right, about individuals. For example, we've seen some of our customers have, in their audio recordings with their doctors, they might have the kind of diseases or the medication that they have, and those are all PHI data. Right? You don't want to have that in your lakehouse or in your even your LLMs for that matter. So identifying all of those things, that's pretty challenging when you compare it to a typical structured sort of data, and also more importantly, the data proliferation, right? I mean, we spoke about how frequently this unstructured data is generated. I mean, just the fact that we are having this sort of recording here, it is generated at a rapid pace. It's also easy to share, among and disseminate among a multitude of folks. Right now, social media makes it easy. Internal communications platforms make it easy. We've seen cases where engineering teams have sort of shared SSH keys, among themselves, and all of these are sort of symptoms of the fact that it's easy to share unstructured data without quite realizing that we are sharing really sensitive information, right? For example, JOT tokens, being present in logs, they present a serious security concern, right? Using that JOT token, you might be able to bypass certain security considerations, right? And there's also this notion of the challenge that comes with data governance for unstructured data, right? Because these are it doesn't sort of follow into pre-structured rows and columns. It's very hard rather to establish clear ownership and establish access controls and retention policies for this, and it sort of increases the risk of unauthorized data access, right? So those are some of the challenges that are sort of unique to unstructured data from a security perspective.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned sharing JOT tokens. I mean, there's probably a fairly large number of Git commits that contain a service account key accidentally as a JSON file. With there, and at least you have semi-structured data in JSON, so it's a little bit easier to detect. And there are ways of picking those things up automatically. But that kind of stuff happens all the time, and it does lead to embarrassing situations for companies sometimes where it leads to a compromise essentially of their systems. Now, in terms of governance, what it's a lot harder, I think, to even wrap your head around how do I control access to this type of information that's could be really sprawling. You have all kinds of different document types that you have to navigate. What are some of the ways that companies manage that? What sort of tools or processes are they putting in place?
Yeah, so I think unauthorized access of data, right, I think is a big issue, right? People uploading files into unsecure data locations, and this has been amplified a lot more by tools like ChatGPT, right? I think it was Samsung that banned the use of ChatGPT because I think some internal meeting minutes got revealed. There's some production code which got revealed of the semiconductor sort of design, so there's some actual tangible risks right there, right? And there's also unstructured data also presents sort of an avenue for malware and ransomware as well, right? Like, it can serve as a vector for essentially, for exploiting the file formats and the data storage formats. And, you have customers, who inadvertently click on files, which basically end up being a vector for viruses and all, right? So the way that we've seen customers enforce some of these things is obviously, this antivirus scanning on files and all of those things, but it's not a contained problem by any chance. There's no uniform sort of a silver bullet answer to this. So one thing that I've seen customers also do is to enforce only certain tools being used on your company provided laptops, right? Like, but that doesn't always work. We have this notion of shadow IT where customers use unauthorized tools for sharing data or for processing data, or taking notes, and all of those present actual vectors for data leakage and for unauthorized data access.
I mean, what about like modern data tools like Databricks? They have a lot of built-in support for secure management of unstructured data. Like Databricks has Unity Catalog for governance. So what are some of the features that, we could stick with Databricks as an example? Like what are some of the features that these modern systems have to help with security and privacy, and what are some of their limitations?
Great question. So Databricks and other sort of data lake houses, the data lakes have offer this traditional solutions for securing the data which is sort of housed in them, right? So you have things like role-based access control with fine granularity to ensure unauthorized access doesn't happen. You have data encryption both at rest and in transit, to ensure data is always encrypted and it's never in plain text. And there's also things like data masking I'm sure data masking is provided by Databricks. I'm not sure if anonymization is provided, but data masking is basically a way to ensure that only certain organizations have access to the entire data, and it's on a need to know basis, right? But that still doesn't solve the problem that you have your sensitive data which is actually being housed in the lake house, right? And by any chance, if your lake house does get compromised, or if there is a misconfiguration of your roles, you do end up leaking that information, right? And once you've sort of once you've lost control of the lake house, you've basically sort of given up the keys to the kingdom, right? So because the data is there and you can decrypt it. So I think this is where solutions like Skyflow come into picture, where we can tokenize that sensitive data for you, and what is stored in your lake house is actual tokens in lieu of your sensitive data, which follow the exact same data type as your actual sensitive data. And that way you can have privacy preserving analytics. You can sort of have your cake and eat it too, right? So that's sort of the analogy, and I think that is what is missing in sort of lake houses today. And that's where customers use Skyflow to ensure that the sensitive data, even in the lake houses, is always sort of secure.
Yeah, and I think one of the other challenges, even if you're properly managing everything at the data layer, whether that's like using Databricks Lakehouse or using Snowflake or some other system, the data probably doesn't just exist there. Like it's in SaaS app, some portion of it might be in a SaaS app, your CRM, transactional database, a bunch of different places. So then how do I make sure that the controls I have at the data layer are also persisted across these other systems, so that only someone from customer support or someone from marketing or someone from analytics has the right level of access, regardless of the system that they're essentially interfacing with. So you touched on Skyflow there, and being able to tokenize some of this data. So let's go a little bit deeper there. Like, first of all, like, what are some of the ways that Skyflow supports unstructured data? And then also, can you talk a little bit about more like what is tokenization? How does that support something like analytics without essentially sharing the raw data with the analytics platform?
Got it. Yeah. So Skyflow supports unstructured data in several ways. So we'll start off with the basics. So we allow customers to store sensitive files. Like we have customers who actually store their sort of employment contracts files with us. So you can store actually sensitive files directly in the vault. And we give you the ability to run virus scans and antivirus scans on these files, and also to render them from Studio, which is our management console, and also render them using our SDKs into your applications as well, right? So that way you can sort of render these sensitive documents but completely bypassing your infrastructure and fully in secure environments, right? We also support detecting and redacting PII, from images. So think of your SSN, think of your, your Aadhaar cards and all of those things. Like, we help redact, sensitive information like the face, the number, and all of those things. And we can store that. We can either store that entire redacted file in the vault along with the original file, and sort of like, have your business logic decide when to present which, and also store the sensitive data as tokens as well. And the other way that we can also that Skyflow also helps customers is that, like, we can de-identify sensitive data from text, from audio, and from audio clips, etc., and store these in the vault as well, right? Like, so the example that I gave you about the doctor's recordings, and that's sort of an example for this, like, where the conversation is between the doctors and the patients, where we were able to have them de-identified, right? And this is sort of a plug for one of the products that I lead at Skyflow. We have something called as secure functions, which will essentially help you work on sensitive data without it ever having to touch your backend infrastructure. So if you're dealing with, say, sensitive data, and if you want to stay outside of, say, PCI compliance, you don't want the data to be touching your backend system, right? So we have something called as secure functions, which allow you to run workflows on that, on that document. And if your unstructured data resides in data lakes, like we're talking about, we give you the ability to run UDFs, which are basically user-defined functions, against this data as part of your Medallion framework, to ensure that your sensitive data is never exposed to your applications or your analytics, by helping you with tokenization and detokenization, right? And tokenization and detokenization are a way to at the end of the day, they are a way to obfuscate your actual sensitive data. And we give you tokens which follow the same data format, the same data structure as your sensitive data. For example, if your SSN the token will be in the same format, and you can use that instead of the actual sort of SSN. And that way, even if you get compromised, what is essentially getting leaked is the SSN, is the token, and not the SSN. And so that's what tokenization is. And detokenization is sort of the reverse process, where you can sort of call our API and we would give you the actual value.
In terms of the secure functions, so there I can basically like write some code, run it directly within the isolated environment of my Skyflow vault. So I could, maybe I could do something like analyze an image to, determine how old somebody is. Is this like a picture of their passport or driver's license or something like that? And then essentially just return, is the person old enough or something? But I don't actually have to touch any of that data. Is that the right interpretation there?
That's a fair interpretation. We've seen this, customers use it in KYC scenarios as well, where they want to check if a certain, applicant has a credit score against which they can grant a loan. You typically want to call some sort of, KYC vendors like Experian and TransUnion and all of those guys. And, we have customers who do that as well to essentially, but again, in the confines of the Skyflow vault rather than their own infrastructure. And that way they're outside of compliance.
Right. Because as the like programmer or engineer tasked with that, like from a business logic standpoint, I really just care about like the assertion of, is this person old enough? Is their credit score, above a certain threshold? I don't actually need to see the raw data, just like I don't need to see someone's password to validate whether they input the password correctly into like a login prompt.
Correct. Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
In terms of the tokenization, so if I'm tokenizing data, so I'm essentially de-identifying it, I'm sending those de-identified values down into my analytics platform. Like, how do I use those for actually like running queries against the data without like, can you take me through essentially an example where I'm using these token values to run a query and it doesn't actually break to analytics? I can still do my job as like an analyst or something.
Yeah. Great question, right? So, for example, let's take the example of a marketing, team which wants to run a campaign in a certain region, right? So, to run that actual campaign, traditionally, what the solutions that have been provided are, obviously, your phone number is sort of sensitive information. It's encrypted. So, typically, what analytics platforms do is we have to actually decrypt the data before you actually can see it, right? And this is where sort of tokens are much more helpful. In the sense that you don't need to know the entire phone number. You only need to know the area code. For example, I think 908 is the area code for New Jersey because my phone number is from there. So you just need to know the area code for that, and that is where tokens can help in the sense that it's aware of the context. It doesn't treat it as a single sort of a single entity, but rather a composite entity of your area code, your your actual number, right? So all you need is the area code, and as a marketing team, you can just query on, hey, give me all the customer phone numbers which have this with this area code, and then that's what the tokens will give you back, right? And you can just query that.
So in that case, basically the token that I'm producing is preserving like the area code, and then everything else is random.
That's correct. Yes.
So in terms of detokenization, so detokenization is basically the reverse process of tokenization. So I can restore the original value. So how do you control essentially access to the detokenization operation, and can I detokenize based on seeing different representations of that data? So maybe one type of user I'm going to see it masked, one type of user maybe I'm going to see like plain text, depending on essentially who I am within the organization.
Yeah, no, totally right. That's spot on. So in Skyflow, we have a very sort of fine-grained RBAC system, which can give you access to, you can gain access to individuals based on their roles, based on their organization, and specifically set policies, which are policies which you can write in plain English, saying that, like, say for customer success, the entire sort of phone number is masked, but whereas for the marketing team, you can see the area code, right? So we give you a lot of control over how the organization can see data and can actually sort of call tokenization and detokenization, right? So, and based on these roles is how detokenization will also work. So if you don't have privileges to view the area code, you won't be able to sort of detokenize the actual token when it comes.
Okay, and then I think we've been mostly talking about unstructured data in the form of like analytics. How do we, get this into, a lake house or data lake so that we can start to open it up to our analyst team. But one of the most common areas now, or biggest uses of unstructured data, is in generative AI. So how does some of the things that Skyflow supports in unstructured data fit into the world of LLMs?
Yeah. So, maybe we should probably spend a few seconds sort of, setting base on some of the challenges that we see, and we can sort of, go to how Skyflow can sort of, help alleviate those challenges. So, we are seeing a lot of issues. We're seeing a lot of issues around security and privacy with unstructured data, in their use with LLMs, right? So to begin with, we know that, LLMs are trained on, rather the foundational models that they're trained on huge volumes of data, both structured and unstructured, and using billions of parameters, right, to basically come to help in tasks like answering questions, completing sentences, and the myriad other ways we use sort of ChatGPT today, right? If any of the data which the LLM is trained on has sensitive data, it might be revealed, back via sort of a cleverly sort of constructed prompt. Right, and we don't talk about this often enough outside of Skyflow, but LLMs don't have an undo button, right? So if any sensitive information finds its way into the model, it becomes really, really hard to disentangle it, right? And this will obviously fly in the face of several compliance and privacy laws across various countries, right? And so those are the set of issues with the foundational models, right? So once you have your foundational models, which are provided by OpenAI, Cohere, Mistral, and all of those vendors, companies also do things like fine tuning that model for a specific task, or using RAGs to basically to essentially update that model to make it much more current, because a lot of these open foundational models have a limit, and also to make it much more relevant to the task at hand, right? So you might be feeding the entire company's internal documents to the foundational model via RAG, and then via a process called as embedding language models, you can sort of convert that into sort of a vector DB, and then sort of the AI model can understand and give you the right answer, right? So all of these are vectors for your sensitive data to seep into your model, and for the model to eventually sort of via some clever prompt or something to reveal sensitive data, right? And also inference, right? The fact that you as a user could be inadvertently, entering some sensitive information into the vault, sorry, into the model, could also serve as an input for sensitive data to leak into, into the model, right? So these are some of the challenges that organizations typically face with, as they're scrambling to build on top of LLMs, which is what every other company is doing today. So the way that we can help, the way that Skyflow can help these organizations is along each of the steps that I mentioned, we can help de-identify that data. We can help ensure that the user prompts are all sanitized and the user response are all de-identified and the right level of data governance is applied. And essentially what we have is basically an LLM gateway, which can help in model training and model fine tuning, right? What we do is we can enable a privacy safe model by ensuring that all the training data that goes into your model is completely de-identified, right? And also on the inference side, we can protect the privacy of sensitive data, from being collected by inference, and making sure that it's de-identified the right way back to the actual users based on their sort of access policies, right? So that's where Skyflow can help a lot with the on the generative AI side of the house. Yeah, so I think one thing I'm just mentioning is that in addition to doing all of this, what we also provide is that we also help you get certified with an external sort of an auditor saying that all the data set that we've de-identified is actually it meets the highest standards of privacy and security, right? And not a lot. I don't think there's any other vendor out there who does that, right? And this is actually huge in healthcare, right? In healthcare industries, which are sort of governed by HIPAA, you really want to ensure that not only you're doing a good job, but you're ensuring that a third party also says that you're doing you're doing a good job, right? So that's the other benefit of using Skyflow, Skyflow's LLM gateway.
Yeah, that reminds me of a conversation I had a few episodes ago that was focused on document redaction, and in that episode, they were talking about their services primarily in legal and how when you're doing it for legal documents, you need the redaction service to be really, really high precision, because essentially you don't want something to slip through that shouldn't be there. So you have to have essentially a human in the loop and people sort of certifying that. So I can see how for in particular healthcare, you're dealing with I don't know, doctor's notes or audio files from doctors and hospitals. There's a tremendous amount of potential PII exposure risk.
Yeah, and also we are flexible enough to give you the ability to specify your own sensitive information as well, right? Of what is relevant to you. For example, your internal company project name might be sensitive information, right? And we give you the ability to define that as part of the input to our gateway, and our sort of APIs will detect that pattern and will ensure that when that's also redacted. So not only PII, but you can define your own custom sensitive data as well that you don't want the LLM to be trained on.
Yeah, I can see that applications of that in say pharmaceuticals, where if you're developing a drug, you might not want basically the name of the drug is the name of the product, so you don't necessarily want that leaking into the LLM, and you don't necessarily want everybody in the company having access to knowing when are we what are the timelines, what's the status of the drug rollout, or depending on the role, if you're in customer service or you're an administrator, you don't need that level of access to that information.
Correct. Totally. Exactly.
And then how do you see, management of privacy and security for unstructured data, evolving in the future? A lot of this stuff is fairly new, especially when we're comparing it to sort of traditional relational databases, structured data. Are there trends or emerging technologies that people should be aware of that you find particularly interesting?
Well, that's a great question. The management of privacy and security for unstructured data will continue to evolve in the face of technological advancements and regulatory changes, and the evolving sort of threat landscape, right? I think if I had a crystal ball, the way that I would sort of characterize this is, I personally would see that there will be an increased adoption in sort of privacy preserving technologies such as polymorphic encryption, differential privacy to enable data analysis and ensure that your LLMs, the way that they're trained, is on completely de-identified data. I would see that becoming much more mainstream and much more and much more of a table stakes than it is today. And this is where exactly that Skyflow can help you. Thinking more ahead, I feel on the threat detection side as well, we'll see that AI and sort of machine learning algorithms will play a significant role in detecting and mitigating sort of threats in unstructured data. You could leverage advanced analytics detection techniques to identify suspicious behavior and potential security breaches in sort of real time, right? So those things don't exist today. So I see that could be a possible evolution. On the data governance side, I feel the data governance frameworks will become much more robust. We will see much more heftier fines being levied on these organizations in case of these breaches. So we already see that in various countries sort of starting to pop up. So I feel organizations would start to invest more in technologies to track things like data lineage, data quality, data retention policies to demonstrate that they are in compliance with that law, right? And I think regulatory authorities would also start coming down harder on organizations to ensure that sensitive data doesn't find its way into either analytics or LLMs, right? And we'll see more organizations being held accountable for this. I think overall, enterprises would need to stay much more vigilant while we adopt these technologies and make sure that they're adopted in a fair and ethical and in a privacy preserving manner.
Do you think that because of some of the things that we can now do with LLMs, that some of the management around unstructured data, at least in particular like text data, when we're trying to get it into a format that we can actually start to run analytical operations against it, will become easier? Like we're going to lower essentially the barrier to entry and all the tooling that we need to essentially set up the metadata correctly, use some sort of essentially map it to some sort of format that then we can then query. Like a lot of those things feel like you could actually involve generative AI to figure out as part of the ingestion pipeline.
Yeah, no, totally, right. But I think the only caveat there would be to make sure that while you're ingesting, you want to make sure that you do classify, and you do detect automatically, whatever the sensitive data is that you care about, and making sure that once it gets into the model or gets into your lakehouse, it is in a de-identified manner, and you can't sort of link it back to the original data set, or maybe sort of and then sort of infer some sensitive information out of that. I think those will be some of the challenges. So I think the data ingestion piece would I think you would see much more impetus there, especially in real time. Right? So in real time, doing this would be much more harder rather than in batch. So I think that'll be an interesting area to watch out for.
Yeah, and it would also be expensive with the way that these a lot of these models work currently. It'd be a lot of API calls that you'd be making, so it might not be worth the expense.
Exactly. So which is where sort of this medallion architecture comes into play, right? Like you can have this bronze where you can do near real-time processing, where you get the data in near real time, but you're doing the batch processing of the ingestion into the silver layer in a much more batch manner rather than a real-time manner. So, but yeah, so totally agreed on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. Joice, I want to thank you so much for being here. And I think this is it's kind of like a merging area, like unstructured data, some level has been, in the zeitgeist for a decade or so, but with, I think, the growth of LLMs and also the growth of platforms like the Lakehouse and a lot of the work that Databricks and other modern data platforms are doing, it's really bringing it to the forefront as companies actually start to draw insights from this sort of historically untapped resource.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think the need for privacy has only grown much more after this sort of Cambrian explosion we've had in all these AI models, right? So I think this is a problem that will only get much more acute as time goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, and cheers.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me.